Thank you very much. That was a very kind and generous introduction. Of course, you never feel like that when you're at your desk, you know, reading everything. Think, oh, I can't do this. But anyway, sometimes it works. So what I'm going to talk about is the different ways in which I've used an intersectional method to explore different aspects of care. So my structure is going to be, first of all, I want to explain how care lends itself to an intersectional perspective. And then I'm going to look particularly at migrant care work. I just want to scope it a bit and explain how it's a field that's an area that's full of multiple inequalities and complex dynamics. And then the third thing that I'm going to do is explain how I tried to kind of come to terms with all of that complexity by combining two methods, an intersectional method with a multi-scalar approach. I'll explain all these things as I go along, so don't worry if you don't get what I'm saying. And then in the last section, I'm going to go into my more recent work where I've used intersectionality as a praxis. And I will explain what that means, but how I've moved from using ethics and care ethics into thinking about what transformations are necessary. Right. So let me explain, first of all, how I understand care as a multifaceted concept. And as such, one that lends itself particularly well, not moving forward. So, right, so care exists in many different forms. It exists as a relational practice, you know, between involving personal, sometimes intimate activities between those who provide care and those who receive care. It exists in those forms as paid and unpaid labour, highly gendered, usually unrecognized or low paid. It exists also in that relationship as power. And it exists as well, as Mary said, as the basis for making claims. It exists as policy. And it also exists as an ethic or an ethical practice. And more recently, people have started to talk about the care economy. It exists as an economy. Now, these last two, and of course, as an economy, it's organised at different scales: local, national, international, global, transnational. But those last two, the ethic and the economy, are slightly different in that they invoke a more generalised sense of care that involves everybody, all of us, right? We all care or are cared for in some small or large way. Whereas the others, the ones above, focus more on care as support received by those unable because they're young or because of old age or frailty or disability, unable to care for themselves. Now, there's a lot of slippage between those two meanings. And there's a lot of slippage in my work between those two meanings. And actually, that doesn't worry me because I think there's a lot of slippage in real life between those two things. So that somebody who is cared for can also be somebody who looks after their grandchild or something like that. So as I say, I don't mind that slippage in case anybody questions me about it. So in all these facets, so I want to explain how intersectionality is, how care lends itself well to an intersectional method. At a very simple level, intersectionality is an understanding of inequalities and power as complex, as interlinked, as shifting, and as multifaceted, which constitutes both penalties and privileges. In other words, our experiences of power and inequality are constituted not simply by, say, our gender identity, but or our racialized or class positionings, but by the multiple places that we occupy on many salient and changing axes of inequality at any given time or place, right? So it changes if you think about your own experiences. Sometimes one thing matters more than another. Um, because it's because it's highly attuned to the complex and multiple ways in which power works, and also how these are resisted, it's very useful, therefore, to look at the relationship of care between carers and providers, because these themselves they involve gender, but they can also involve class, they can involve race, they can involve ethnicity, migration, sexuality, disability, age, and so on. A whole load of different forms of identities and inequalities are in there. But also, importantly, it's linked in its kind of in its pedigree, in a way, to social justice, and this is very important, right? It's an approach which has a long history in Black feminist struggle around race, gender, and class and sexuality. Its origins were in Black feminism of the 1970s and 80s, and it has emerged as an important way of analysing the political and the institutional problem of invisibility. And that was what Black feminists said. You know, in the feminist movement, it was dominantly white, and they were not seen as Black women. In the civil rights movement, dominated by men, and they were invisible as women, right? So they, from that sort of analysis, that experience, emerged this idea of the importance of intersectional power. So, as such, intersectionality is important because it focuses on unearthing the lived experiences, especially of those whose voices are not heard or are marginalised. And you can see, to begin with, that this is important for care, because this is the whole history around care, and especially around the kind of history of struggles and campaigns for care. And if I just do a very quick history, you can see how these different sorts of invisibilities started to be revealed. So, to begin with, in the 1970s, feminist work, feminist research did a lot to bring care out into the open and reveal the invisible, unequal, and devalued work done by women in the social reproduction of their families, caring for younger and older people, doing the everyday cleaning and looking after the household, and so on. And the women's movement sought to make claims to the state for the recognition of this in different ways, and to attempt to move away from the assumption that they were inevitably dependent. You know, the notion of dependency was very important to those campaigns, and how they were marginalized because of this from paid work. Now, by the 1980s, you had the disability movement coming on the scene, and they reframed this concept of disability, of dependency, to highlight the marginalized experiences of disabled people in institutions or even in kind of private home care relationships. And what they campaigned for was independent living supported by personal care assistants. Now, by the 1990s, you've got this greater demand for care services, right? More women going into paid work, more care needs, and different ways in which societies started to struggle with this. And one of the ways that emerged was by involving more migrants in care work. And this in itself, well, to begin with, to be absolutely clear, in the 1990s, it involved in this country, white working class women. And then as more kind of needs for caring and cleaning and all of these things emerged, it developed to become migrant women. But what you got from this was a new set of complex issues around the question of care and questions of equality. So it moved in a way, not from gender, but with gender, to include disability, class, race, ethnicity, migrant status, and also the implication of women coming from poorer countries to do care work in European countries was that it introduced the question of geopolitical inequalities as well. The relationship between the richer and the poorer world. So let me now explain how, let me just explain a bit more about migrant care work, because that's one chunk of work that I spent a lot of time looking at. So as I said, multiple inequalities, complex dynamics. Today, globally, 70 million of the 169 million migrant workers are women, and a significant proportion of them work in domestic and care work in higher income countries. It's a global phenomenon, and yet at the same time, there are significant variations between different countries. Across the world, 17% of domestic or care workers, again, there's a lot of slippage between the work that they do, are migrants. And that, I mean, that's an average. In some countries like Saudi Arabia, they are the majority of carers. In other countries, there are fewer of them, a lower percentage, I should say. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's not just a global north, global south issue, right? So what you find is that you have movement within regions as well as across regions. But although you have that movement, it's always poorer countries to richer countries, right? So, for example, domestic workers from Indonesia go to Malaysia, Singapore, and Saudi Arabia. And within the north, after the enlargement of the European Union in 2004, more women from Central and Eastern Europe worked in care and domestic work in Northern, Western, and Southern Europe. So you have a situation now, for example, where Germany receives elder care workers from Poland, while Poland receives domestic workers from the Ukraine. Germany, Austria, and Switzerland all operate this new form of circular migration, whereby a care worker will arrive in somebody's household to look after an old person or two old people for between 2 to 12 weeks. And then they'll go back home and somebody else will come in, perhaps somebody from their own family. And in that way, the worker looks after her own family, manages the care of her own family, and also gets paid for the care that she's providing. But these trails transect older tracks from colonial relations. So those are still relevant. Indian and African workers coming to the UK and Latin American workers going to Spain. So it's a complex kind of set of layers of movement. The other thing is that there is a lot of diversity of employment and migrant status and also care activities across all these different countries. So the worker may live in the home of the person that she's looking after, and this is the pattern for old age care in Southern Europe, or she may be employed in an institution, a nursing home, a care home, right? And that's the pattern here in Britain, usually. She may work for a few hours a week or every hour God sends her. She may do domestic and care work or just caring work. She may be self-employed. She may receive cash in hand and be part of the grey economy, or she might work for a private agency. She may be working in terms of her migration status under a special permit, like the ones that I just mentioned, the circular migration migrants, a temporary visa, or she may be undocumented, as a lot of people are when they're looking to wait for papers, or she may have achieved recognition of citizenship. So it's a great diversity, and one that I've called one of converging variations. Now, I've described the variations, but in terms of the converging, it's because there are some very important commonalities to this situation. What's common, excuse me, is that domestic and care work around the world carries all the hallmarks of non-standard employment. It's temporary, it's part-time, precarious, low-waged, insecure, flexible, and very little collective organisation. Excuse me. So little recognition for people's skills. It's seen as unskilled work in many cases. And in fact, in Europe, most care workers are overskilled for the work they do. And workers complain of sexual harassment, racism, bullying, all sorts of things like this. So it can be quite oppressive in many ways. The pay gap between migrant care workers and non-migrant care workers is 19.6%. And that's also higher when you look at the aggregate migrant pay gap, of all migrants. Then care and domestic workers get, the pay gap is still 12.6%. And yet they are essential. A recent very good report, actually, from the ILO that came out last September calls them a critical component of care infrastructures and workforces around the world. And the care systems in many richer countries would collapse without migrant workers. And their work, in many ways, what they're doing, reflects some of the most important changes and inequalities that we can see in society at the moment. First of all, the greater needs for care in high-income countries, women's involvement in paid work, combined with declining fertility and an ageing of societies, has meant that there are more needs for people to be cared for. And especially since the global financial crisis, there have been political imperatives from a lot of countries to cut back on social expenditure and to cut back on care as well in some places. But such deficits are no less significant in lower income and some middle income countries, where there's been a greater reliance on a female wage, with care needs intensified by unemployment, wars, climate change, and increased chronic illness like AIDS, for example. And these place enormous responsibilities on women to care without infrastructural support for basic amenities. And of course, these are some of the reasons, just ignore that, these are some of the reasons why women migrate in the first place. But of course, that process of migrating intensifies the care needs of those left behind. Also, there have been changes in state policies. In some countries, such as the Philippines, the state manages the export of care labour quite intensively, actually, because that provides the country with a source of foreign currency. And that foreign currency is seen to be needed because of the debt that a lot of developing countries have from past structural adjustment policies. And this has reduced those countries' reduce their capacity to improve their own health care and education infrastructure, and giving, it's a kind of vicious circle in a way. But also in many parts of Europe, care policies have changed as well. So they've shifted from providing public services, or in some places, like Southern Europe, very few services at all, to giving people cash payments, direct payments, or tax credits to buy in care or domestic help in their private homes. And of course, there's been an increasing reliance on the, not simply on the state, but on the voluntary and especially the for-profit private sectors to deliver care as well. And in this country, where local authorities contract out provisions such as domiciliary services, nurseries, or residential homes to the private sector, we've seen a worsening of pay conditions and labour shortage. And into that steps those who are most marginalised in the labour market, and that is women migrant workers. But their precariousness is exacerbated by migration policies, which in countries of destination have become much more restrictive, and where the social rights of migrants have been reduced as well. So on the one hand, we have this rather kind of strange situation with a dependence by richer countries on migrant care workers, but also, on the other hand, restrictive migration policies themselves, in part, a response to populist and political ethno-nationalist and anti-immigration sentiment. And this is part of what I have called the global crisis of racialized borders, and that's something I'm going to come back to later. Now, not only does this situation reinforce inequalities of gender and race in employment and migration as well, but it creates a wider set of geopolitical relations of inequality, as I mentioned before. Whereas welfare states and households in higher income countries are able to solve their care expenditure costs by buying in cheaper migrant care or domestic labour, which itself adds to the depletion of care provision in the migrants' countries of origin. And although I'm saying that migrant care work reflects recent changes, social and economic changes, policy changes, it's also, it's a new phenomenon, but it reproduces what I call a condition of colonial extraction. And what I mean by that is that a number of welfare states that had colonies have used taxation from those colonies to build their own welfare states, and have also used labour from those colonies. And so in this country after the war, labour from the colonies, female labour, was invited in to cover the labour shortage, often in health and care, that existed at that time. And they existed at that time because there was an ideology that women did work, but an ideology that women shouldn't, go out to work full time. So they were brought in to kind of hold up this pattern of white women not going out to work. And I think what you can see now is migrant women being used in a way, in the same way that there is a pattern of dual earner households, not necessarily both earning the same amount, but dual earner households that have care needs. And these people are kind of supporting that new pattern of family life. So you need a decolonial analysis on that, on this issue. That's what I'm saying. Now, to summarize this, I've argued that this amounts to a global crisis of care, this continuity and change. And I've tried to summarize that by saying that there are two interlocking dynamics of both continuity and change. And the first is the devaluation of care. And this is long-standing. When I've been saying there are continuities, long-standing invisibility of care as women's work, whether it's unpaid or paid, because it's usually low paid, plus its subordination to a lot of other issues, to work, to productivism. And long-standing too, as I've just mentioned, are these geopolitical inequalities of colonial and post-colonial care labour. The second is one that I draw from Shirin Ray, who you're going to hear later in this series, is the depletion of care. And as I understand it, that's the current failure to provide the resources that give people the capacity to care and to be cared for, material resources, time, financial support, space, and so on. So I've tried to show how that's being created in richer countries and how the solution of migrant care work is intensifying that depletion in countries of origin. So let me now move on to how this situation, complex, lots of inequalities, lots of things going on. I mean, what I haven't been able to do is to show you the different ways in which countries are different, but I'm concentrating on, intersectional analysis today. So I want to get back to this question of the intersectional method to study this complex diversity across countries, and the fact that it exists also within a complexity of structural inequalities which operate at different scales. That was, I mean, I started this work on migrant care work over 20 years ago, but by about 2015-16, this was the issue that I thought, well, actually, we need some sort of framework to look at this. Now, one of the criticisms about intersectionality, which I think is valid, actually, in some analyses, is that it's become depoliticized, that it's sort of cut itself off from questions of social justice, right? It's actually no more than diversity, describing diversity, and I've seen quite a lot of that. So it's very important to me that if I'm employing this method, that I ensure that my analysis of the close and the personal is embedded in some sort of understanding of the wider political economy. So, actually, can't go into this question now, but this is also an issue that's taken up with the concept of care, but we can talk about that later if you want to, that it also concentrates, it's too parochial. It concentrates on the parochial things and doesn't sort of, unlike social reproduction, doesn't lead out to capitalism, which I disagree with. But anyway, what I like about intersectionality is that if it's used properly and with social justice in mind, it also avoids reductionist thinking, right? Because people have it's not about a single cause. It's not about saying, well, it's neoliberalism, isn't it? There we are. We can explain this. It's more complicated than that. It's more fluid than that. And it rather than being called a theory, it's being called an orientation that recognizes that contexts can be fluid, contradictory, and contested, right? It looks for more than single causes. And that too has kind of influenced how I've been thinking about this. Although I should say that it isn't the intersectional method that's influenced me. It's the empirical data that's influenced me. I've worked from the data upwards and thought, oh, well, this is how you do it. And then looked at what people have said about intersectionality. So there we go. So this is the framework of analysis that I developed for this work. And this, in my mind, enables you to do cross-national comparative work across different countries that can take into account the kind of the everyday experiences of care and care work, and the sorts of claims that come from them. As I say, these are saturated in all these different social relations. And it can also, I'm going to give you an example, but I won't, I think. I'll go straight on to the meso. So in the meso, I asked, what are the institutional factors that shape this micro relationship in any particular country? And I came up with the idea that it wasn't just care policies, it wasn't just migration policies, but it was actually the intersection of these different areas of policy. But I didn't either just want to look at policy, because what's important is also care cultures. What are the kind of legacies in a particular country? I mean, I mentioned earlier that in Britain there's the pattern of older people going into nursing homes, whereas in Southern Europe, older people are looked after at home. So there are different legacies as to how care exists, different practices, different cultures around these things. But also, just to note a point about intersectional method. I've done two things here. I've extended that notion of intersectionality to a higher level, in a way, to the level of the institutional and the political. That's one thing. And also, what that process of deciding that it was the intersection of care, migration, employment regimes represents in the process of doing intersectional analysis is that, and this is the answer to the criticism, oh, but there's so many things, how do you do it? You know, oh, there's this and there's that and there's this and that. How do you choose? You know, and you have to work out from your data, what are the most salient things here? And now somebody could disagree with me, actually. I've disagreed with myself in a way, because I've said that I think I've missed out equality regimes. I think those are very important. So it's that process of deciding which things are most salient. That's so important to intersectional method. You know, for researchers, that's very important. And then these two are linked, and then it's multi-scalar. These are the scales that are linked together, and they don't just go upwards or downwards. They move between themselves. Then there's the macro, and I call this in the end the transnational political economy of care. And I tried to kind of work out what were the different aspects that were important. You know, there's the care capital. You know, care is big business now, big international business, and people open nursing homes in Thailand and England, you know, all over the place. And then big business as well are the recruitment agencies that work on behalf of states, as well as on behalf of these businesses, migrating, you know, getting people, recruiting people to move them to different countries. And then there are the big international organizations like World Bank and ILO, which are very important. And then there are organizations, it's a mobilization around the claims of migrant care workers. And one very important one, which culminated in an ILO convention, the Convention 189, Decent Work for Domestic Workers, was passed in 2011. And that was the result of an international network of migrant workers, very unusual, actually. And it was passed by the ILO, International Labour Organization, and it's very unusual for them even to not just be dealing with trade unions, but to be dealing with these women. And what's important about that movement is that it's a convention which member states are invited to ratify. But when the member states have done that, UK hasn't, when member states have done that, it's enabled collective organizations in regions and in localities to use that to fight for rights, and then to go sort of back up the scale, from the local to the national scale. So, it's this movement between scales, which I think is very important. Right. Now, that point is an important point to move me on to the next. Oh, that was just an example. To my last section, which is about intersectionality as praxis, from ethics to transformations. Big gulp of water for this one. Right. So this question of mobilization takes me to the question, what do we do? What are the possibilities for the transformation of care, given this, quite awful situation, really? What should we do about it? And what I find is helpful about intersectionality, or the way some people have used it, is that there is a coherence between using it as an orientation, as a way of analyzing, as a method, and also its praxis. And by praxis, I mean the possibilities for intersectional solidarities and political alliances for transformative change. So any of you who are involved in any sort of activism, you may have come across, intersectional practice by activists, which is about recognizing different groups, forming alliances with different groups, recognizing common themes. And this is what I mean. This, I think, are the political implications of this sort of analysis. What sort of political ethics for action can we kind of begin to see emerging in some ways? Now, in my book, as Mary mentioned, I argued that to understand the complex inequalities, some of which I've just been talking about, we need to go deeper than saying that these are produced just through neoliberal welfare states or just through the global financial crisis, although that crisis is very important. And I say that there are three other further crises that are particularly salient for understanding the deeply intersectional nature of inequalities and their global nature as well. I've already mentioned two, which is the global care crisis and the crisis of racialized borders. And of course, no surprise, the third one is the crisis of the environment and climate change. And I argue that these two intersect. So if you think of COVID, the situation of COVID itself was a microbiological form, result of environmental change, right? And that was about the lack of the essential nature of care, but its lack of recognition. And also the fact that care workers and migrant care workers in particular, they suffered disproportionately, their mortality rates were disproportionately high. And it was also about the problems that beset migrant workers in that situation, that some were sent back to their countries wouldn't let them in, that they couldn't send money home because all the agencies to send money were closed, all sorts of things, right? So, and that was the collision of these three things, right? Now, what all these crises have in common is that they all represent threats to our social and planetary sustainability. They amplify poverty and inequalities, and they jeopardize our mutual solidarities. But at the same time, they're all being contested. And this is very important. And what's emerging from researchers and activists are kind of new ideas about how life should be organized. But even at a local level, the sanctuary cities network, very important, those cities that declare that they welcome and support migrants and refugees. Global women's strikes, Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion. There's a lot going on. And also on the ground, what we call prefigurative practices, people doing in the present what they hope for the future, new collective ways of caring for older people, new cooperatives dedicated to environmental action. Now, my argument is that in these challenges to the crises, there are many synergies that contain the possibilities of a new political ethics that might underpin a future way of understanding social policy, or bigger than social policy, society as well, but in which care is central. So let me explain what I mean. So if we look at care, new work on care, there's been loads of books on care which have all tended to emerge. Got the Care Collectives, Care Manifesto, Caring Democracy, Hilary Cotton's work, and also there's a queer approach to new queer approach to care called Radical Tenderness. And many of them are building on the ethics of care, either consciously or unconsciously. And that ethics of care is so important, right? Because it's about exactly that. How do you institutionalize an ethic of care that is central to care justice? And the argument is that care is central to human life. If its ethics are about interdependence and human flourishing, and seeing these as the basis for human action. And that in itself, it sounds sort of obvious in a way, but actually it's a total challenge to Western liberal philosophy, which has been based on rationality, individualism, and autonomy. This is, a real challenge to that sort of thinking that we, there's a lot of our institutions are based on. And care ethics have been applied to democracy, highlighting the values of communication and trust and so on. They've been applied to public space, to architecture. And more transformationally is this question about how do you change the political and how do you change economic and political life? How do you, as I've said, institutionalize an ethic of care? We know that it could involve developing a caring, democratically run infrastructure in which values paid and unpaid care, gives people and institutions time, financial, practical support to be able to care and to be able to be cared for. It requires equal access to public space and transport, policies that counter poverty and discrimination. And, we know that this begins to kind of challenge that global crisis of care around devaluation and depletion. But it would require a new economic model. We can't just sort of summon that up as nice things to do. A new economic model that challenges the priorities of macroeconomic policies, of productivism, of the market, of competition and consumerism, of growth and geopolitical inequalities. And it's here that care ethics begins to share some of the demands of climate and ecological justice advocates, who also create important synergies between these feminist ideas and climate activism, especially those who are arguing for a post-growth or degrowth economy and against productivism and profit imperatives. And one example of that, I don't know, some of you probably know Kate Raworth's work on donut economics. And this is the donut. I won't go into it all, but basically she puts forward, I think, a very good argument, which she argues that we have to replace orthodox economist models of growth and profit with what it takes to make flourishing societies and stay within the planet's resources. We have to do those two things together. An economy, as she says, that can express humanity, justice, generosity, and human spirit. And indeed, we can begin to see that emerging in some areas. This report, A Care Society, A Horizon for Sustainable Recovery, by the Economic Commission for Latin America, has been very clear in bringing in framing its work around both sustainability of the planet and also care. Sustainability of the planet requires a development pattern that places care at the center of priorities, recognizing the interdependence that exists between people and the environment. Very important that some places are beginning to think in these terms of these synergies between the two. But we can look to all sorts of other areas as well. Actually, I ought to mention as well that UN Women have just produced a report on feminist climate justice, and they call this the care climate nexus, a situation which is a site of risk for women, but also a site of mobilization. Very interesting. So I can see Mary getting anxious about time. Are you okay? I won't be long.
5 more minutes.
Yes, that's nice. Yeah, that's what it'll take. So there's been similar coalitional thinking behind the history of behind contestation by Indigenous people and communities of colour. And one excellent book is by David Nguyen Pello called Critical Environmental Justice. And he talks about what he calls the campaign against what he calls environmental racism in the United States. And he says how that movement was very important. I mean, God knows what will happen now, but it was very important in that it fused discourses of public health, civil and human rights, anti-racism, social justice, and ecological sustainability. Even then, you know, we hardly hear about that in a lot of environmentalists' accounts of change. He says it articulated a transformative vision of what environmentally and socially just and sustainable future might look like. And then, of course, there's the Buen Vivir movement in Latin America, particularly in Ecuador and Bolivia, developed in different ways by indigenous people. And here thinking centers on a cosmovision in which people strive to live in harmony with nature. And again, interdependence is at the center of this, interdependence between people and also with nature as well. And similarly, in looking to an idea of democratic coexistence, they also talk about pluriversality, which is an idea of redistributive justice, which respects difference and diversity. I mean, all of these things actually being practiced by people as well. You know, this is about deep dialogue across different groups, cultures, and cosmovisions. Very similar, I think, to feminist groups who practice intersectionality in action. Also, if you look at some of the key decolonial thinkers, somebody like who have looked to expand new understandings of humanity. And Paul Gilroy has said we have to work towards a new planetary humanism, which I think is a wonderful, succinct way of talking about this. And Sylvia Wynter, very important anti-colonial philosopher, she says that the struggle of people of colour is more than being against, more than being allowed into present humanness. It's about consciously and communally creating what she calls a new ecumenical notion of what it means to be human, broadening that notion of what being human is about. I think all of that strikes a note with the ethics of care, with Joan Tronto's work, for example. All of it does. So finally, let me draw it to a conclusion of sorts. So these are the principles, I think, that come out of this work. And I've been applying it to social policy, really. I think that policy and action about transforming care could be strengthened by bringing these different sorts of ideas together. And it would emphasize the relationality of our being and our interdependence with each other and with nature as well. It would be underpinned by the principle of human flourishing. But it would be about these following principles: that relationships are planetary in a geographical sense of a global interdependence. But secondly, they're planetary in the sense that interdependence is between humans and the ecosystem as well. It extends to non-human beings and living organisms. Third, that interdependencies summon up intergenerational obligations to future generations, the ones who will inherit the planet. We've got to focus on that. But at the same time, they also invoke the dehumanized racial and other suffering of past generations. That is very much what reparation for ecologists in the third world is about. And I think that idea of reparation can be applied to care, but that's another thing that I've been doing. So that these signify that these commitments would signify material and moral obligations towards reparation. And all this would demand a more radical and critical understanding of humanism, in which cooperation, coexistence, and solidarity are enacted in a respectful and democratic dialogue that can balance universalism with pluriversalism. Right. Thank you. That's the